Boa tarde a todos, sejam bem-vindos ao nosso seminário. Nós vamos ter agora essa primeira sessão com a professora Linda Vaz, e ela será coordenada pelo ministro João Paulo dos Reis Veloso, e eu devo dar alguns avisos para vocês. Então, todas as sessões serão gravadas e nós temos um sistema de tradução simultânea. Então, quem tiver interesse, os fones de ouvido estão lá fora, estão disponíveis para todos, e vocês devem utilizar o canal A, para que possam ouvir a tradução. Então, todas as sessões, então, serão gravadas, e a gente depois vai poder disponibilizar esse material para vocês. Tá ok? Bom, quero dar também as boas-vindas, agradecer muito ao ministro sua presença, coordenando aqui a mesa, e, sinceramente, agradecer à professora Linda Vaz, que vai nos brindar aí com a sua conferência de abertura sobre as questões do Estado Nacional nos tempos que correm. Então, muito obrigado. Ministro, por favor, a palavra é consigo.
Obrigado.
Está ligado.
Boa tarde a todos, principalmente às meninas. Eu já disse que só estou aqui hoje por causa daquela menina, Ana Célia. Vocês sabem, estou na virada final de mais um fórum nacional que vai ter lugar no dia 17 de setembro. Então, é com satisfação que vamos começar esta sessão de abertura desse seminário internacional. Eu acho que eu vou levar meia hora pronunciando o título e subtítulo. Reposicionamentos estratégicos, políticas e inovação em tempos de crise. Metade. Economias nacionais e empresas frente à concorrência chinesa no contexto da crise financeira internacional. Finalmente, acabou. Título e subtítulo. Como vocês sabem, o seminário vai durar 3 dias aqui no Fórum de Ciência e Cultura, de modo que podemos começar nesta sessão de abertura com a conferência da professora Linda Vaz, da Universidade de Sydney. Então, com a palavra.
Okay, I too would like to thank my hosts, Antonio Castro and Ana Celia Castro, without whom I would not be here. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be joining in this conference. And it's an honor, actually, to be addressing this audience and to be revisiting this wonderful, vibrant city once again. What I want to do tonight is to punch some holes in the influential idea that our global era is the era of the neoliberal state. And I want to go on to suggest that globalization, to suggest the opposite, in that globalization valorizes, calls forth an activist state. And I will elaborate on what I mean by that in a while. About a year ago, actually about a year before the US financial meltdown began to unravel the global financial system, I was asked to do a state-of-the-art piece on the role of the state in the economy. And some of what I'm going to say tonight is based on that paper which has been circulated. I'll go a little bit beyond that, but I'll start with the observation that after years of being relegated to the sidelines of social science analysis, especially in the globalization literature, the state as an economic actor is being rediscovered. And for many years here, theorists and advocates of globalization have been imparting the message that the state should not, that the state cannot, and indeed that the state does not play an active role in economic development. Today, however, you can hardly pick up a news item or go to a conference or read a learned paper without being told that the GFC, the global financial crisis, is bringing the state back in. And based on the book proposals that I've been reviewing lately, I can confidently predict a rash of books with titles like Economic Patriotism, The State After Neoliberalism, The New Mercantilism, and so forth. So there is obviously some basis to this newfound interest in the state's economic role. If one considers, for instance, the massive government interventions worldwide that we've seen recently in order to cope with the GFC and to, as it were, restart the credit system after a loss of more than $40 trillion. Or even the bold new themes that we've been seeing in public discourse, such as the New York Times editorials, which are calling for a different kind of capitalism. Public statements by the high priests of unfettered capitalism, like Alan Greenspan, who conceded that he'd found a flaw in his bedrock belief that markets could regulate themselves. I made a mistake, he admitted. As one American New York Times journalist commented wryly, even laissez-faire has suddenly become much too French for the Americans, who but moments ago treated it like the Holy Grail. We're all regulators today. That was an almost unthinkable statement a year ago. But today, 1 year on from the worst financial shock since the Great Depression, it's become almost fashionable to proclaim that the state is back. However, the gist of my talk, what I want to argue tonight, is that the state is not back in business, but rather that it's never been away. Now, of course, in the dominant discourse, the message is rather different, right? The marriage of neoliberal reforms, plus the expansion of global markets, we're told has dramatically narrowed the policy space to advance the state's economic goals. And that the state's role in governing the economy has been reduced to use this rather well-known phrase, reduced to tinkering around the edges. And the reasoning here is quite plausible. It goes something like this. If public assets are privatised, if trade is liberalised and tariffs and subsidies prohibited under the WTO, and if capital is mobile and the nation-state is not, well, what then is left for the state to do other than to facilitate competition, provide the most attractive environment for transnational capital via low taxes, easy labour laws, and generally a permissive regulatory system? Okay, so what I'm proposing is that although this worldwide diffusion of neoliberal reforms is real enough, the idea of a neoliberal state is not. And by that I mean a much-used label by neoliberal. It's a much-used label in our times for a developmentally inert or passive state, a state that is structurally constrained by global markets and ideologically committed to playing the minimalist role of market facilitator, competition regulator. This kind of state, I argue, was always a fiction. And I'll go on to suggest that nowhere is this fiction more evident than in the United States itself, in that so-called heartland of laissez-faire capitalism. As to why the neoliberal state is a fiction, and why the fiction has been influential, I think, are the questions that need to be addressed. And I'll do that with the aid of some empirics, some theory, and some sociology of knowledge. And empirically, there are a number of ways in which this thesis of neoliberal state transformation unravels. I'll mention 5, aiming for breadth rather than depth, under 3 different headings, mixing in some conceptual, theoretical argument as I go along. Under my first heading, I'll do some pulling down of the orthodoxy. I'll focus here on what has not transpired, contrary to a core claim of the neoliberal argument. And under my second heading, I'll begin to add some scaffolding to my activist state argument. And I'll be touching there on 3 different forms of state activism. Under my third heading, rounding off the empirics, I'll move on to a more specific case, taking aim at neoliberalism's ideological fortress and the archetypal neoliberal state, the United States. So under my first heading, taxing and spending activity, I examined the idea, and I've done this in the paper, of the constrained or disciplined state. And that's where I do some pulling down. And the point I make here is that one of the core claims of neoliberal state transformation of that argument has not been established. Although it's a core claim, it has not been established. And this is the claim that openness to the global economy produces a discipline or constraining effect on macroeconomic policies around the world by inducing increased budgetary pressure, by exerting downward pressure on the government's taxing and spending activity through the increasing mobility of finance capital, generating tax competition among nation states, hence tax reforms, in order to retain and attract investment. And with a similar eye to attracting investors, governments, it is claimed, will shape their macroeconomic policies to avoid inflation and deficit spending. So having had to review this literature recently, I concur with IMF economists who observe that there are surprisingly few tests of this discipline effect, and none of them match theoretical plausibility with robust causal evidence. The most exhaustive IMF survey in this context concludes very cautiously that at most there is some, and I'm quoting here, modest evidence that financial globalization may have induced countries to pursue low inflation policies. However, there is no evidence that it has encouraged low budget deficits. And similar results are reported in many other surveys of this literature, which finds that globalization has not affected the nation state's ability to conduct independent fiscal policies. Okay, so the main point that I wanted to bring out here was that a core claim of the neoliberal argument about this relationship between international market exposure, macroeconomic policy, and the tax and spending structure, although widely presented as a fact of life, has not actually been established. And as the most recent econometric analysis concludes, the effects of globalization might therefore be exaggerated and might simply not exist. We can go a step further and give this skepticism some theoretical backing. So, because, you know, as the economists would say, that's all very well in reality, but what's the theory? So from a theoretical perspective, the positive effects may not exist because the effects of globalization, of global integration, are ambiguous. They're ambiguous because of what I and others have called the enabling logic of globalization. The point being here that there is not just a constraining or disciplining logic to globalization, the one that seems to have excited most attention, but rather there's also a politically enabling logic, which, as I've argued elsewhere, tends to valorize state power. And with some notable exceptions, this aspect of globalization has been very poorly studied. Actually, it isn't too hard to see these enabling effects all around us today, being played out in the variety of state responses to economic uncertainty, set in motion by the current turbulence in financial markets, of course. But state activism has much longer roots than the current crisis. For example, similar pressures for state responsiveness have long been unleashed by volatility in commodity pricing, by the effects of trade competition, and by the race for new technologies that trade competition has set in motion. And these are points I'll come back to in a moment. But the main theoretical point I'd like to make at this point is that rather than shrinking policy space, economic integration produces the turbulence and economic uncertainty that creates new domestic pressures, new incentives, and new opportunities for state involvement in the economy. And depending on the context and the problem at hand, this involvement may mean corporate bailouts, as we're seeing today. It may mean social insurance. It may mean a developmental drive for new technology, or even the creation of sovereign investment funds. I'll have something to say about each of these under my next heading that I'll turn to now, where I add scaffolding to my activist state argument. And the point I want to make under this activist state heading is that long before the GFC, long before the financial crisis was on the horizon, states have been involved in a broad swathe of activities, some recent and some older in origin, but all entailing a level of activism inconsistent with the neoliberal argument and the neoliberal label that has been applied to states in our time. Regulatory, developmental, and financial activism describe the three major ways in which the state's economic role has been enhanced or maintained by the global diffusion of neoliberal reforms. Let me say something quickly about regulatory activism, which I outline in the paper. And here, the sort of starting assumption, privatisation, did a lot to kick-start the idea of the state's dramatic withdrawal from the market economy. But the research has shown that, yes, while the withdrawal of the state as direct producer of goods and services has been a general and important trend, so too has been the growth of the apparatus of regulation in those same sectors. So that rather than removing the state from the market, the neoliberal drive has actually required national authorities to set new rules of the economic game. For example, devising competition policy for telecommunications and other recently privatised utilities, or setting prudential norms for deregulated financial institutions, and sometimes choosing not to do so at all, and so on. The point being that deregulation has been accompanied by a process of re-regulation, and that points to that paradox of freer markets meaning more rules, to use the title of Stephen Vogel's book, Freer Markets, More Rules. And that in turn has meant the creation of new governance structures to set and apply the rules, giving rise to a multitude of decentralised regulatory agencies and hybrid entities, public-private structures, which, being effectively removed from democratic oversight, in principle give the executive rather more room than less scope for action. And hence the paradox that researchers point to, the paradox of this deregulatory trend that a number of writers have observed, an unexpectedly larger role for the state and a new arena for state activism in these newly privatised sectors. And it's interesting to note that privatisation doesn't mean the final exit of the state or even an exclusively regulatory role. Evidence from the Brazilian steel sector, and I owe this sort of insight to my colleague Leonardo Bellomarchi, evidence from the steel sector shows how through various public sector entities the state has remained an important provider of capital, equity and loan finance, even after privatisation, overseeing Gerdau's international expansion. And the examples could be multiplied. Regulatory activism is the most widely discussed counter-trend to the neoliberal qua minimal state, but it's by no means the only one. Another relates to the state's developmental activities, in particular its technology activism. So I'll look at that next. It upsets another tenet of the neoliberal state argument. And this is the widespread argument that, or understanding rather, that states no longer do industrial policy. It's a very widespread argument, understanding, that states no longer select or target particular sectors for promotion or resource allocation, because to do so would involve interventions in the market that are no longer acceptable under the WTO, under the multilateral trade regime. Well, in this connection, the creation of the WTO, which has overseen extensive trade liberalisation, is posited as a key pillar of the neoliberal order. And where developing countries are concerned, it's been powerfully argued that the WTO has been kicking away the ladder, that it's been prohibiting the very policy tools, the tariffs, the subsidies, the capital controls, the imposition of local content requirements on foreign companies, all of the tools that the now industrialised states once used to grow their own economies are now more or less prohibited under this regime. So the ladder-kicking metaphor is useful, but only up to a point, I would argue, because the multilateral rules have indeed made it more difficult for those lower down the ladder. However, the same rules enable and encourage those at the top to add new rungs to continue ladder climbing. And the point here is that the sectors that matter most to the advanced economies are knowledge intensive rather than capital or labour intensive. And it's here, under the rubric of science and technology policy, within the multilateral framework, that the developed economies have carved out space for their own activism, that they've been establishing the new infant industries of the so-called knowledge economy, chiefly by setting the subsidy rules that mesh with their own technology profile, which of course is knowledge intensive. And it doesn't take much to work out that the new infant industries of the so-called, of this knowledge economy include biotechnology and the life sciences, which incidentally are both state-sponsored industries in the US. They include microelectronics, information technology, new materials, nanotechnology, robotics, and now, of course, new energy. And the point about these new infant industries is that they don't need old-style tariff protection or even export subsidies to encourage production. What's much more important here for these new growth sectors is infrastructure and subsidies for R&D, which is the most risk and cost-intensive phase of knowledge-based production. They need as well intellectual property protection and public sponsorship of venture capital funds. In the US, for example, the world's biggest venture capital fund for startups, the SBIR program, is run by the federal government, providing more than $2 billion of subsidies annually to innovative American-owned firms. European governments are pretty active too in this area. In biotech, which is the new platform technology, the European Union is complementing national programs by doubling financial support for innovation to $91 billion under programs that will run to 2013, while Free Market Britain last year dedicated $6 billion to its own biotech sector alone. The examples again could be multiplied and extended to other high-tech sectors, but they all illustrate essentially the same thing, namely that this is infant industry promotion, high-tech style, with a renewed role for state activism. In other words, not just passively setting tariffs, as in the past, but channeling resources to particular sectors and subsidising the most risk-intensive stage of product development in the advanced technology economy, which is the production and transformation of knowledge into applications. So the more general point is that national authorities in the industrialised, and I would add a few catch-up economies as well, they're doing a good deal more than simply shaping the macroeconomic environment, as the neoliberal view of the global economy tells us. They're targeting technologies and products for development, setting funding priorities for R&D, initiating and coordinating standards, creating markets for new products through technology procurement, commercialising and licensing public R&D, spinning off companies and intellectual property to the private sector. And most of this activity has been carefully relabelled as S&T policy, science and technology policy, under the WTO. That relabelling is important because language matters, but it doesn't hide the fact that it's effectively infant industry policy, or as some would say, open economy industry policy for the high technology economies. Moving now to financial activism, my third and final example. This takes different forms, and I'll discuss two, one old and one relatively new, starting with the newest, and that is the rise of the investor state in the form of sovereign wealth funds. These are state-owned investment vehicles that are typically funded by foreign exchange reserves, reserves that are derived either from the rapid growth of commodity prices, mainly oil and gas, or from large trade surpluses in manufactured goods. Hence we see the rapid growth of these funds in the oil-rich nations like Norway, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and in large exporters like the East Asian countries, China and Singapore, for example. In terms of sheer size, these funds are currently twice the size of private hedge funds worldwide, with total assets estimated to be nearly $3 trillion. And it's the circumstances of their rise that link back to my earlier point about the valorising or state-enabling logic of globalisation. And there are two observations I'd make here to lend support to that idea. First being that the rise of sovereign wealth funds has occurred in tandem with the expansion of the global economy, because worldwide we see about 30 to 40 of these sovereign funds, and most of the growth has been concentrated in the past 2 decades, with about 20 funds being created in the last 10 years alone. The second point being that the motives for setting up these funds suggest a causal connection between global integration and the rise of the investor state. Some were set up to stabilise fluctuating revenues from the volatile pricing of commodities, and others were created in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. And we're now witnessing a third wave of these sovereign funds as national governments seek to create a cushion against global turbulence in financial markets. So the national investment funds represent one of the most important ways in which nation states are trying to hedge against uncertainty. They also have played a very significant role recently in stabilising the global financial system by helping to recapitalise the major banks, fending off a more serious meltdown of the US financial system, and even earning a favourable European Community assessment on their activity in a world that's been starved of credit. But quite apart from their role in financial stabilisation, there's potentially also a developmental dimension to their activities, because if we look at, say, Norway's sovereign fund, with some $400 billion in assets, about equal to its GDP, it's thought to be the world's second largest fund that's now investing in renewable and clean energy companies. China is the other fund to do likewise, indicating the potential of these funds to become major actors in catalysing new energy initiatives that produce new industry sectors, and therefore a form of industry policy promotion. Okay, so as I mentioned, the sovereign funds now look set to take off. The French President Sarkozy thought that the funds were such a good idea that he proposed that all European leaders set up their own funds to act as a cushion against financial instability, adding the typically French touch that the funds could be used to buy stakes in critical industries to shield them from foreign takeovers. And the French and Taiwanese set up their own funds last year. Japan is set to join the club, and many others, Brazil too, I'm told, is now poised to do likewise. So arguably, global turbulence has created a boom in these sovereign wealth funds, and that may well open a new developmental chapter in the state's investment activities. The second and older example of financial activism is one that's prominent in the news today. And that's the public sector's role in rescuing and sustaining the credit system. In fact, financial activism here has a lengthy history. And the historical pattern shows that the public role increases as the global expansion of capital flows increases the volatility, the incidence and intensity of financial crises, usually following bouts of liberalisation. I'd make 2 points in this connection. One is the Kindleberger point, that financial crises have been a familiar and regular feature of global capitalism for over 200 years. Financial globalisation and financial crises have gone hand in hand. In their paper, Is the 2007 US subprime financial crisis so different? Harvard economist Kenneth Rogoff and co-author show that periods of high international capital mobility have repeatedly produced international banking crises, not only famously as they did in the 1990s, but historically. And the related finding is that the majority of historical financial crises are preceded by bouts of financial liberalisation. In other words, financial globalisation begets turbulence, which begets public intervention, which leads to my second point, that government intervention in the financial market has been the rule, not the exception, in spite of some authorities, like Michael Gloss, the German economic minister, who was quick to declare that European interventions for the banking and insurance sectors were an indispensable exception to general free market policies. In spite of that, there's in fact nothing exceptional about government intervention to secure the credit system and rescue the banking sector following a financial crisis. Public bailouts and nationalisations are the norm, and they have entailed a massive role for the state as primary investor, financier and lender of last resort. The US, for example, the lodestar of non-intervention in the market, has a lengthy experience in engineering bank bailouts, an experience that runs from Alexander Hamilton's efforts during the panic of 1792 right through to the investments made by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the 1930s, when it acquired stock in 6,000 banks at a total cost of $500 billion in today's terms, to the more recent takeover of half the nation's savings and loans institutions in the 1980s and early 90s. In the developed countries alone, there have been 18 major bank-centred financial crises in the recent post-war period prior to 2000, all producing major declines in economic performance and requiring major interventions over a sustained period. The 2008 global financial crisis is the latest in this series, and it's perhaps unprecedented only in the eventual scale of the public interventions that will be needed to repair and restabilise the financial system. So what these historical and contemporary episodes reveal are two things. First, that government rescue of the credit system has been the norm, and its involvement substantial and protracted. And second, global national entwinement, that the global economy is necessarily entwined with the state's domestic powers. In other words, 200 years of financial crashes, manias and panics carefully charted by Charles Kindleberger have underlined how the stability and functioning of the financial system is not self-constituting, but is closely entwined with the state's regulatory and financial powers. As a side point, I'd say that what we see in the case of the US financial crisis is an instance of quite deliberate regulatory disentwinement via acts of regulatory omission and commission, which gave rise to an enormous shadow banking sector, which was given free rein to make dodgy investments and pile up enormous numbers of toxic assets. And that being more a case of willful refusal to regulate than regulatory failure. But my general argument has been that thus far, that empirically at least, we live in an era of state activism, that global integration and state activism go hand in hand. But the larger theoretical point that I would want to make is that, contrary to expectations, globalisation doesn't marginalise the state's role in the economy, but by constantly creating uncertainty, turbulence and pressures for domestic responsiveness, globalisation valorises the use of state power, both for restoring financial order and more generally for continuing economic advancement. I hope I've got some time to move now from the general argument to the particular case of the United States, which is widely portrayed as the archetypal neoliberal state. I'll start by noting that US capitalism is not just free market, laissez-faire, deregulated capitalism. It's true that its financial sector most closely approximated the free market brand, but this was always an incomplete model of US capitalism. There's another dimension to US capitalism. It doesn't get much attention or much discussion, It's possibly not as sexy as Wall Street and certainly not as visible to the public eye, but it forms the core of America's real economic strength, and it underpins its exceptional innovation capacity. And this other dimension is a formidable techno-innovation system which has turned out virtually all the major platform technologies on which US industry today is based. So in spite of an influential view of the US as a neoliberal state with a free market economy, its federal authorities have built the world's most formidable technology development model. It's a state-driven model based on procurement-driven innovation that uses more resources, takes more risks, and produces more radical innovations than any of its competitors. And in particular, as part of my own research on the American state, I conclude that it would be difficult to overstate the developmental importance of federal technology procurement as an engine of US innovation and economic advantage. In other words, to the question, where do US innovations come from? A very large part of the answer would have to include government contracting to buy things from the private sector that do not yet exist. That, in essence, is the meaning of technology procurement. Think of it as a powerful lever of demand pull, because the federal government both creates the market for the product and subsidises its development 100%. And contrast that with basic purchasing or basic contracting or patronage, which occurs when the government gives handsome contracts to companies like Halliburton or KBR to do something that everybody knows how to do already. A few examples of how this impacts. Well, it's now very well documented that most of the high-tech sectors in which the US economy now leads, from computers and software technologies to semiconductors, commercial aircraft, medical devices, biotechnologies, and the life sciences, owe their start to the funding, infrastructure, and purchasing programs of the federal state. And in particular, to the programs sponsored by that network of defence and security agencies that comprise the so-called national security state. The Department of Defence, the Department of Energy, NASA, the CIA, as well as the National Institutes of Health. Today, the government spends 20 times more than any other government in funding, commercialising, and procuring these innovations from the private sector. Now, conventionally, this developmental role of the national security state was once more or less concentrated in the so-called military-industrial complex, a term that suggested a discrete area of activity that was somehow fenced off from the real economy. But fencing off developmental activism and calling it defence sector or military-industrial complex doesn't stand up to scrutiny these days, if it ever did, because there is no longer such a fence, if there ever was such a rigid barrier. The developmental role of this national security state via procurement activism now reaches right into the civilian economy. And in a myriad of crisscrossing ways, it's morphed into the civilian sector. Over the past 25 years or so, the role of the federal agencies, for example, has been, that is the goals and programs of these agencies, has been broadened to encompass economic competitiveness and commercial strength as part of their security mission. The key federal agencies now define their mission as serving dual markets. Sponsored innovations must serve both commercial and government markets, crossing that military-civilian divide. And so this merger of national security with economic competitiveness functions has produced a series of hybrid structures, a sort of hybridized development model in which the lines between military and civilian, security and commerce, public and private, have been thoroughly crisscrossed and their functions intertwined. So, for example, the national security agencies now take on private sector characteristics, acting as angel investors and commercialisation strategists, turning, for example, publicly created intellectual property into profitable products and viable industries. The DOE, the Department of Energy, its venture funds move federally funded innovations from the labs to create startup companies. The Department of Defence's Centre for Commercialising Advanced Technology, another example, looks inward to serve its security missions and outward to foster marketable products. The CIA and the Army as well take equity in young companies to create commercially marketable products that can also serve security missions. So there's a strong developmental hands-on core to the US model of capitalism. But what US developmentalism has lacked is broad political legitimacy, normalisation of the kind that you find in the East Asian version. So it's remained relatively hidden. And so you get a normative environment that regularly demonises industry policy for strictly private commercial results, unless it's framed in the language of national security and linked to that pursuit. Okay, so speeding ahead. So in this sphere, at least, the American state is more developmental than neoliberal. So what I'm trying to highlight here with the US case is the problem that's raised by tying polymorphous institutions like states to particular labels like neoliberal, readily apparent in the US context where one finds both liberal and quasi-status components in those parts of the state that interface with the private sector, which leads... do I have 5 minutes just to round off? Which leads to my final and more theoretical argument as to why the neoliberal state is a fiction. And there are 3 strands to that argument that I've already touched on, so I can be very brief. And they relate to the state's enablement, the state's entwinement, and its polymorphousness, to use that clunky term. The one strand discussed earlier, the state enabling logic, arises from the pressures for state responsiveness to economic uncertainty created by global turbulence. Another theoretical strand to the neoliberal state as fiction argument is what Michael Mann has referred to as the polymorphousness of the state, meaning that the state is a non-unitary configuration that may well be neoliberal in one sphere, such as trade unionism, yet developmental in another, such as technology. It might be a promoter of free trade in some sectors, like financial services, yet mercantilist in others, such as agriculture or textiles. And the United States is the exemplary case, mercantilist in agriculture, neoliberal in labour markets, but directive and developmental in national innovation. A third and final strand of my argument involves this idea of structural entwinement, as I also touched on earlier, implying that global economic networks, corporations, credit markets are not purely self-constituting and self-sustaining. They actually depend on the help of national territorially based networks. And that involves the regulatory, financial and infrastructural powers of the nation state. I won't be able to give you interesting examples about the bond market, but so if we want some theory for the empirical patterns that I've been discussing for why the neoliberal state is a fiction and state activism is the norm, then we have a starting point in global national entwinement, state enablement and polymorphousness. I don't have time to go into why this fiction has been so influential, but that would take us into the sociology of knowledge. And there's been some very interesting work done there recently on looking sort of into the history of ideas, social sciences, how they dropped how they expunged the whole idea of state autonomy from the social science treatments, and how this dates back to the Cold War, to the sort of geopolitical imperative after 1947 as US-Soviet relations soured and the general fear of communism spread. So the idea of state autonomy that was fairly prominent in the literature, even in economics prior to the Second World War, was quickly dropped. And then a new conceptual dichotomy was born, which sort of constructed this sort of dichotomy of the strong state equals totalitarianism, the weak state equals capitalism and the free market. And the point of that dichotomy was that it served the important political purpose of maximum differentiation of the Western American system versus the Soviet system. And it created a powerful intellectual legacy, a sort of paradigm in which today, which we still see the effects of that legacy, a paradigm that constructs the state as the problem and presents a sort of society-centred, bottom-up view of all the major decisions that affect public policy. So I think I'll just leave. I'll leave it there before I run away with myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weiss. Will you take the questions from the audience? Some questions.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
If you'll take questions from the audience, from the floor.
Shall. Yes.